Okay, is a recession coming in 2023? So this video is going to be a little different from my usual fare in that I'm not going to talk about media entertainment, but instead the state of the economy. And I know it's not what you signed up for, but bear with me. I think it's important, and especially if you are a millennial like me, or if you are a Generation Z worker. 2022 has been a whopper of a year for a lot of reasons. My last video highlighted some of the news just in the last couple of months, and it hasn't gotten better since then. I don't know about you, but my social feeds have been filled with people who have lost their jobs, who are worried about losing their jobs, and in general have anxiety about the economy going into 2023. Everyone keeps talking about a recession coming in 2023 after we have already gone through a bunch of layoffs in Q4. To be candid, I've never seen a news cycle fixated so much on the state of economy like I have seen in the last year. There has been a constant flood of articles and TV spots about whether a recession is coming, whether we are currently in a recession, how long a recession might last, and how bad it might be. And it's particularly fascinating because no one seems to quite agree on what is going on. Keep in mind, though, that all of this is happening at the tail end of a pandemic that spanned multiple years, drove inflation up to a 40-year high, and turned the labor market into a wild, wild west. Now, there were tremendous gains for employees in terms of bargaining power due to this phenomenon, which I applaud. But we are also seeing the whiplash of uncontrolled growth. Why do I care about this? Well, I'm a human with a job, and I care about other humans who have jobs or who want jobs or want to have better jobs than they have. I am not an economist, I don't work in finance, but I do spend a lot of time looking at information related to the job market for my job, so I feel relatively informed about what is going on. So what is going on? Well, we are headed for a recession in 2023, or maybe 2024, or maybe we just had one, or maybe we're not going to have one at all. I have literally seen all of these opinions. And maybe it's just proof from an oft-told joke that economics is the only field in which two people can get the Nobel Prize for saying the exact opposite thing. When the powerful want answers, they turn to economists to tell them what is going to happen with the economy. But economists don't predict the future. The National Bureau of Economic Research is responsible for telling us when we have had a recession in the US, but their approach is retrospective, and they don't commit to a predetermined mix of specific indicators. They can use any of several different measurements, such as GDP growth, unemployment, and consumer spending, to assert that there has been an economic downturn. But these data take time to collect, and they tell us when a recession happened, not when a recession is going to happen. The truth is that no one knows if there is going to be a recession in 2023 or 2024 or 2025. Economic downturns are difficult to predict because how the economy performs is impacted by how people feel about the economy. To predict economic performance, you have to look at a lot of variables, but you also have to make guesses about how investors will react to those variables, like the war in Europe, and also about how companies are going to respond to challenges like rising prices, consumer spending, labor shortages, or what their competitors are doing. So if we aren't for sure in a recession, why have so many people lost their jobs recently? Well, in 2022, companies took advantage of indicators that a recession might be coming to lay off workers. Some did this because they had to eliminate expenses for survival, but others were looking to right-size the workforce for an economy that they think is coming in the future. This was particularly pronounced in the tech industry, but other industries have also been impacted. And the reasons vary. A lot of VC-funded technology startups were impacted by falling stock market performance earlier in the year. Technology startups run on borrowed money from investors, so when investors aren't investing in growth, costs must be cut to stay alive. Some businesses were impacted by adjacent industries like the housing market. And then there were organizations like Meta, which made a huge investment in a vision that wasn't panning out and doesn't look like it's going to pan out. And I don't even want to talk about Twitter because I feel like that's a whole separate video. Other companies were worried that they hired too fast or too much or at inflated salaries following the frenzied labor market that came after the pandemic. Some technology companies saw increased demand for digital services during this time, but some of this demand has declined since the pandemic has started to wind down. Most of these companies have legitimate reasons, arguably, for either scaling back hiring or conducting modest layoffs. I don't like it, and I feel bad for people who lost their jobs, especially right before the holidays, but I understand the business reasons behind those decisions. However, I have also seen a concerning amount of conversation in social media that suggests that some executives and managers and business owners view layoffs as an earned punishment for workers who demanded too much. I have seen anger expressed at workers for not participating in the labor force at the lowball wages that the organization wants to pay rather than what the market demands, or anger that workers are being too demanding in other areas, such as wanting remote work to continue to be an option, or organizing unions to demand better working conditions. I've also seen inflation blamed on workers as if rising prices are solely due to workers asking for wage increases, as if there wasn't a pandemic that crippled the global supply chain, that drove up inflation, as if organizations didn't overreact to the situation by laying off way too many people in 2020, as if there wasn't a war in Europe, and most importantly, as if employers aren't ultimately responsible for setting wages. So, with the news that a recession might be coming, some executives took the opportunity to conduct layoffs in order to reassert their power over the workforce. Given all of this, it is not surprising that a study by the Conference Board showed that 98% of CEOs believe that a recession is coming in 2023. They have a good reason to want to believe that a recession is coming. The question is, will a recession actually come? And that's harder to say. As of right now, we don't have hard numbers on how much unemployment has increased. The Bureau of Labor Statistics released its latest report in early November before a lot of the layoffs happened, and the next one won't come out until January. In late November, though, unemployment was at a healthy 3.7%, which is just a smidge above where it was before the start of the pandemic in 2019. I do suspect that that number will go up with the jobs report that comes out in January, but, and this is important, I don't think it will be anything like it was in 2020 or even in the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. I also don't think that it will rise that much more in 2023. If we have a recession, I think it will be mild, especially in comparison to these more recent recessions. And this is a hot take, but hear me out. First, let's talk more about what a recession is and how we know if one has happened. A recession is often described as a fall in GDP, gross domestic product, for 2 consecutive quarters. However, this is not the official definition. Numerous indicators are used to assess economic activity declining, including reduced output in production, reduced employment, and reduced spending. This decline in economic activity has to last for at least 2 months to count. On average, recessions last about 18 months. The Great Depression of the 1930s, though, lasted for about 10 years. And it's important to understand this because the recessions of recent memory have been atypical in how they presented and in how long they lasted. If you are a millennial or Generation Z, meaning anyone born before 1981, your first time experiencing a recession as part of the workforce would have been the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009, and your only other experience is the COVID-19 recession of 2020. And I think employers forget that, especially when they are talking about communications and how to talk to their workforce transparently about what is going on and why. The Great Recession lasted 2 years. However, the impact was felt for much longer, especially when it comes to growing wealth inequality. People are still experiencing difficulty finding work from the impact of the Great Recession. A lot of people just left the workforce and never came back. Wage growth flattened and stymied for lower wage earners, despite corporate profits soaring. And the federal minimum wage hasn't been raised since 2009, which is the longest it's gone without being raised since its inception. Interest rates have also been maintained at historic lows, which helps investors make money, but not everyone else. Paired with global outsourcing, industrial machines, and artificial intelligence replacing jobs, economic anxiety has steadily increased and it has sharpened our political divide. And then came the COVID-19 recession of 2020. The pandemic interrupted supply chains, and there was a lot of news that a deep recession was coming. This caused a panic, which led corporations to lay off over 20 million workers. That is an insane amount of layoffs, second only to the Great Depression of the 1930s. But then, guess what? Predictions about the severity of a pandemic-driven recession were, in my opinion, dead wrong. Officially, the COVID-19 pandemic recession only lasted 2 months. 2 months. Basically, as soon as all of those people were laid off, organizations started frantically trying to hire them all back, with the exception of leisure and hospitality, which includes things like airlines, hotels, and restaurants. Demand for goods didn't go down, they just shifted. However, companies found rehiring difficult to do for numerous reasons. Some people didn't like how they were treated and refused to go back to work where they felt disrespected or where conditions were dangerous. Quite a lot of people changed industries or occupations completely because the jobs they had weren't there anymore and they needed to work in order to survive. Some people discovered that they actually liked not working, especially people in double-income households where both people working may not actually have been necessary. Some people couldn't return to work, especially parents, because their children couldn't go back to school or to daycare. Some people decided to retire early, some people decided to start their own businesses, and in addition to all of this, legal immigration plummeted. The overall result was a labor shortage, or at least the perception of a labor shortage. I say perception because the labor still exists. People of working age are living in the country, but they aren't working. People weren't being incentivized sufficiently to take the lousy jobs that were being offered. Many people were also discouraged by the job-seeking experience, or they don't have the skills to get the jobs that are open. Others are choosing to opt out of the labor market to care for children or other family members or themselves. With everyone trying to hire all at once and there not being enough people for those jobs, we entered into this crazy labor market that was and continues to be employee-driven. With sky-high job openings continuing for over a year, we saw a surge in turnover as employees left dissatisfactory positions for better employment experiences and higher pay. We also saw a rise in disengagement as well as demand for better employment experiences. More rewards, more upward ability, and greater work-life balance. The quiet quitting movement became popular on TikTok and has been a subject of great discussion and a lot of misunderstanding in HR circles and among business owners. The political discourse on this situation was, and continues to be, absolutely insane. In early 2021, you probably remember, there was all this finger pointing by politicians that government policies were to blame for labor shortages, like saying that people weren't returning to work because of Democrat-issued COVID stipends. But we know that this is nonsense because the stipends aren't actually enough to live on by themselves, and because some states refused to take the stipends, yet all states suffered from labor shortages and continued to suffer long after the stipends ran out. Even if you take into account that people have more savings from either stipends or just spending less during the pandemic, it doesn't fully explain the situation. In my opinion, worker laziness is not among the challenges that the labor market is facing today, not even if you take into account sentiments like anti-work, laying flat, or act your wage. People want to feel good about the work that they do and to be treated with dignity and respect by the people employing them. We have entered a period where humans are demanding more humanity from their employers. They are also demanding more reward for effort and for outcomes. No one wants to work themselves into the ground to make someone else rich. People don't not want to work, but they do want their work experiences to improve. And as previously mentioned, there are some folks in the business world that think or hope that a recession will solve this problem. The reasoning goes that if unemployment goes up, competition will go down, and employers will regain the leverage that they used to enjoy. But I personally do not think so. I think that this is wishful thinking. It doesn't match up with the sentiment of the populace, and it also doesn't match up with the data. So let's look at the data. Murmurs that a recession is coming began in the spring of 2022. This was concurrent with 2 quarters of negative GDP growth. This faltering of economic expansion is in alignment with a possible recession, but the causes are numerous. There has been continued disruption with the supply chain, volatility in the stock market, the implosion of cryptocurrencies, and Russia's invasion of the Ukraine all at this time. Even so, the negative returns in Q1 and Q2 are only slightly negative for the US. And to make matters murkier, there was an uptick in the GDP for Q3. I would say that the biggest challenge is that inflation rose in 2022 to levels that we haven't seen in 40 years. And I have seen a lot of politicians blame Democrats for high inflation, especially around the midterms, but come on, that's absurd. High inflation is driven by global supply chain issues from the pandemic, which are still impacting productivity around the world. Scarcity of supply means increased demand, and the war in Europe added to this problem, especially where oil and gas are concerned. The stimulus bill passed by Congress did add to this somewhat, but it can't be the primary cause because the US is nowhere close to leading on inflation. Here's what inflation looks like globally. As you can see, some countries are experiencing triple-digit inflation. Among G20 countries, Turkey has it the worst, with inflation at 85%. Inflation in the UK is at 10%, but it was higher a few months ago. The United States is certainly not in a happy place when it comes to inflation, but it is faring average comparatively. It should go without saying that high inflation that is not under control is bad for the economy. It devalues the dollar. It is especially hard on retirees living on their savings, as well as low wage earners who are living paycheck to paycheck. And unsurprisingly, employees have been clamoring for raises due to inflation because they understand that if their pay doesn't go up as much as the cost of goods, that they will effectively have taken a pay cut in terms of their spending power. And I should warn you, employees are unlikely to see wage increases in 2023 that are as high as inflation was in 2022. This isn't because employers are greedy jerks, though. It is because raising wages tends to be offset by raising prices, especially in certain industries like food services. When prices are raised, inflation goes up, creating a vicious cycle that further devalues the dollar and creates even more economic instability. Instead of setting pay to cost of living, employers tend to set pay according to cost of labor in a specific market. Now, cost of labor is impacted by cost of living, especially in lower wage jobs, but it's not a one-to-one ratio. So we are not likely to see a 7% wage increase in 2023 on average for everyone across the board to combat inflation. However, that doesn't mean that you won't get a raise. It is looking likely that raises will be higher in 2022 than they were in previous years, maybe 4 to 5% on average. You might also earn a market adjustment if your job is worth more now compared to previous years, due to competition for talent driving up pay averages in your job market. You could also see a pay raise in alignment with increased skills, new responsibilities, higher performance, or tenure that moves you up the pay range for your position. And that is my cue for one shameless plug. If you don't know what your job is worth on the open market, or if you do and it's gone up a lot, you should submit your data to PayScale's online salary survey. I am not being paid to say that. PayScale is not a sponsor of this channel, but I do genuinely think that doing salary research benefits most people when it comes to pay raise negotiations. You will either get useful information or you will provide useful information for someone else by doing this. While you are doing that, let's talk about what is being done to curb inflation. The US Federal Reserve, in alignment with other central banks around the world, have steadily been raising interest rates throughout 2022. Raising interest rates makes investing more expensive, which makes investors more hesitant to invest, especially if they believe that rates may be lowered again in the future if they are patient enough to wait it out. This slows economic activity by lowering the demand for goods, especially expensive purchases that have to be financed and paid off over time. For example, hiking interest rates makes it more expensive to get a loan for a house, which also cools the real estate market. But did everyone applaud the Fed for doing this? Of course not. People in finance started talking about the inverted yield curve and how raising interest rates is going to cause a recession, perhaps a very, very bad recession. Some of these arguments are couched in passive-aggressive threats, at least in my opinion, that the Fed should lower rates again to avoid economic calamity so that investors can make more money. Now, you might be asking, what is an inverted yield curve? Let me try to explain. What this chart shows is the projected interest earned on bonds of equal quality but different maturity dates. To simplify understanding, I like to call this a chart of investors' feelings about how much they will get for loaning the government money in the short term versus the long term. In a healthy economy, this chart shows heftier returns on longer-term bond investments. But when a recession is coming, this chart shows that investors believe that the short-term investments will yield more than the long-term investments. In other words, this is a chart of investor pessimism, and in this case, the pessimism is tied to rising interest rates. The inverted yield curve started to become pronounced in July of 2022, right after reports of that second low-performing quarter for the GDP, and when the Fed began to hike interest rates, and it only got more extreme in Q2 and Q3. This matters because the yield curve has inverted before every recession in the last 60 years except for one. So the reasoning goes, if the yield curve inverted in 2022, it means that a recession is coming in 2023 or maybe 2024. However, keep in mind that there have been fewer than 10 recessions in this time period. In addition, a post-pandemic economy isn't something that we've seen before and might behave differently than other economies of the past. We are in a weird situation where this chart may or may not signal the same thing that it has in previous pre-recession economies. Raising interest rates to tame inflation is the right thing to do, at least in my opinion, and it's part of a global effort to improve economies around the world. I do think that we can expect interest rates to go up in 2023, albeit maybe at slower intervals or at lower fractions. The stated objective of the Federal Reserve is to steer the economy back to a 2% annual inflation rate without causing a recession. This would be called a soft landing for the economy in finance terms. It might be framed as a slight economic downturn or as an economic slowdown. And in my opinion, that would actually be good for our economy, because this is a runaway wild horse which was headed for a cliff. Of course, an economic downturn or economic slowdown is not without its downsides. There have already been layoffs in Q4, and there may be more in 2023, especially if declining trust in cryptocurrencies crashes the financial markets, which they might. My caution to employers, though, is to consider what happened in 2020. A lot of those layoffs were unnecessary and, in fact, detrimental to many businesses. The right thing to do in this situation, only 2 years after massive layoffs, may be to prioritize morale and to communicate transparently about what the business is concerned about, working with employees rather than discarding them. And I will admit that this is atypical advice. Typically, when a recession is coming, it is considered a best practice to lay off a greater percentage of the workforce than you think you have to, so that the business doesn't have to do multiple rounds of layoffs due to a miscalculation, which can impact morale. But considering that the COVID-19 recession was less than 2 years ago, I think that any layoffs are going to be perceived negatively. It might already feel like multiple rounds of layoffs in combination with what happened in 2020. So being conservative may be a wiser bet at this point in time. And for employees who were already laid off, I am so sorry, but don't despair. Polish your resume. I can't predict the future, but I do think that this recession, if we even call it that, will be unlike the last two that you have experienced. I do not think that the labor market is going to cool off to an extreme degree. If you look at data from the last job survey from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you can see that job openings in November were in decline compared to the crazy ride of 2021 and 2022, but still well above where they were in 2019. I suspect that this will continue to dip. I also expect that there will be hiring freezes in the early part of 2023 while everyone holds their collective breath. But companies cannot do that forever. You cannot grow without talent, and we still have less talent on the market than there are jobs available. I do think that recovery will come faster than we expect, and it might come with other benefits. Part of why I think this is that it's been true for decades. It was just more pronounced the last 2 years. Large consulting firms like McKinsey have labeled this era of history the war on talent. And that war might let up someday due to factors like artificial intelligence, which does concern me. Rest in peace, Westworld. No one understood how relevant you were. But for the immediate future, skilled workers are still a hot commodity. What this means is that if you have been laid off, or even if you haven't, now is a good time to invest in skills development. It does take a dogged approach to get a new job, especially in our digital app managed world, but you can do it. I am not kidding. It takes months of persistent effort, even if you are very hireable, so do be patient, but try to be optimistic. Again, in summary, I personally think that this recession, if the National Bureau of Economic Research even calls it one, will feel small compared to the last two and may have benefits that we don't realize yet. It may even have a positive impact on wealth inequality. For that reason, I think it's important for workers to continue to band together and to continue to make demands for improving the working experience. And I felt that that was worth making a video about, especially for millennials and Gen Z who have been dealt a pretty raw hand compared to previous generations where recessions are concerned. The last two have been particularly crazy and particularly detrimental to those generational groups. But I think that this one will be viewed as more of an economic right-sizing. I think companies will take the opportunity to sort out some messes that they have made by growing at a frantic rate the last 2 years and perhaps not prioritizing employees as much as they should. I also think that hiking interest rates in combination with increased unemployment will tame inflation. But I also think that the labor market will bounce back pretty fast and perhaps hotter than people expect, just not to the insane levels that they were last year. And ultimately, that's good. That means, hopefully, better job hunting experiences, especially with pay transparency on the rise, which, if you haven't heard about that, is something that you should look into. I also think that demand for better employment experiences and better hiring experiences will continue. We're seeing a lot of interesting trends around work-life balance, mental health, remote work, equity, and other benefits like a 4-day work week. I do not think the pendulum is going to swing back toward employers enough to stop the meaningful conversations that have been had and will continue to be had around things like late-stage capitalism and the importance of environmental and social governance, even if that has started being called woke by far-right naysayers. So, although there is a lot of worrying news about the economy and a lot more people are celebrating the holidays unemployed than I would like, there is also a lot to be hopeful about in 2023 and 2024. So with that in mind, I would like to wish you a happy new year, and we'll get back to our more regularly scheduled programming next time. If you liked this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Please share it with your network, and please let me know what you would like me to cover in the future. 2022 was a lot of experimentation for me in the arena of YouTube. I am relatively new to this whole video production thing, but 2023 is a new year, so let me know what you would like me to cover in the future. I can certainly use the support to be picked up by the algorithm and seen by additional people so that I can get new subscribers and grow my channel. So again, if you like this content, like, comment, subscribe, hit the little bell so that you get notifications, and until next time.